Catherine is originally from Gisborne and is a trained chartered accountant. In her free time, she works as pregnancy counsellor, and she is a member of the Human Life Committee of the Catholic Diocese of Auckland. Catherine, you are an accountant and a counsellor. This is quite an unusual combination. Which interest came first?
Well, interestingly enough, I think it's interesting. It was accounting. In my school, we were at Form 3, we were at two different schools, male and female schools. Fourth form, we became co-ed, which I think is about ninth grade now. And in fifth form, the girls were allowed to take boys' subjects, traditional boys' subjects. So I was in the first class of girls who was allowed to do accounting. And I was quite competitive. So I really loved the fact that I'd only learned for 1 year and I caught up to the boys, and I found I had a natural aptitude towards it. But even at that young age, I still found that I loved to look at what made people tick. And so I had a strong interest in psychology and things like that. But accounting was what really drove me through my younger years, and has stayed with me, of course.
But then you came to the counselling on top of it.
Yes, yeah. I started counselling pregnant girls when I was 18 as a pregnant teenager. Their parents would bring the girls to me so that their daughters would consider something besides adoption, which was pretty much the norm in those days. So it actually, my mother always says I fell into it. You know, it's not like I went out begging to do it, and then my post-abortive friends started telling me their post-abortion stories as well in my early 20s. So I became fairly entrenched in it from a very young age. You know, it was interesting. I would never have imagined that those chance occurrences would lead me to a life that's so full of all of that work. Both of those three topics really. There's three different lines.
And Catherine, you are working now as a pregnancy counsellor. Can you describe that role?
Yeah. Well, so I do most of my work that I do is post-abortion nowadays. If I get the opportunity to work with pregnant women, it's very exciting because of the fact that it's wonderful to go through the journey with them and give them love and support. And we find about 67% who are abortion-minded will change their mind if they're given love and support and an opportunity to talk unbiasedly to somebody, you know, who's not got skin in the game, you know, so not necessarily the partner or not necessarily their parents, but objective people, give them alternatives. And it's always very rewarding to see the baby at the end, because the mother never ever regrets giving birth, never regrets having a baby. Whereas the other side of my work, which is post-abortion, is full of regret, full of remorse, full of heartache and pain, and often by the time they come for help, they're suicidal. So you're dealing with incredibly vulnerable women. So you've really got both extremes. Although I have to be honest, the joy that you get when a woman has finished her healing and has come to terms with the abortion and has built a healthy, loving relationship with the child and stops condemning herself and has experienced forgiveness and that grace, it's a beautiful thing to see her life changed and healed. So they're just different, you know, they're very different journeys.
What are the reasons why the women come, and how do they come? Some because they see the phone number somewhere or they hear about it?
Oh, well, actually, in my case, because I've been doing the post-abortion work for so long, that often comes by word of mouth because people know me and know that I do this work. So a lot of that comes that way. But the actual formal around the country, pregnancy counselling, there's Haven Pregnancy Centre on the North Shore there's pregnancy centres all around the country. In fact, we're in the process of getting about 23 new centres around the country. So that whole, and a lot of it's internet advertising, a lot of it's in the old-fashioned phone book kind of stuff. But nowadays, a lot of it's internet based. Yeah, but I do think it's a shame we don't get many referrals from the medical profession and things like that. And a lot of that is just purely because it's mostly volunteer based. And so we don't get the opportunity to be front of mind for people. And that's always been a battle, being front of mind. And so if the people go along the abortion path straight away, often they, my post-abortive girls tell me all the time, nobody ever talked to me about continuing my pregnancy. And that's, they don't talk to them about the fact that they could get, that there's schools for high school mums, there's creches at universities, that being pregnant and being a mother doesn't end your career, it doesn't end your life. It actually brings you a lot of joy, a lot of many benefits. And often people look at it in a very short-sighted manner, unfortunately, and they're not looking at the big picture of the grief that may follow the abortion. So often, you see people that have made this choice and they think it's going to change their life. They're going to be able to get on with their life the way it was, but it doesn't. They can never go back to being unpregnant, to being before they were pregnant.
So the pregnancy changes already the life. And
yeah, so often they've done it because they're at university, but then they still drop out of university because they can't bear life anymore, without their child. I had 6 kids one year who all pulled out of university, who all dropped out of university after their abortion. They had their abortion because they were at university and wanted this future, and they all pulled out because they just couldn't cope with the stress of studying as well as the stress of losing their child. So it's really complex picture, and people don't see that big picture, unfortunately. They're in panic mode when they make that decision. Usually they're in panic mode,
And Catherine, you are a member of the Diocesan Human Life Committee. And this committee considers life from conception to natural death, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But this would include the no to abortion, the no to euthanasia, but also no to social injustice. That's Absolutely. What Pope Francis keeps reminding us, that all life is interconnected. So we can't just look at the beginning and in the end. How do you feel about this?
Pope Francis is a wonderful advocate. He's been one of the most outspoken on life issues, and he really does get, as Jesus' representative on earth, he gets that whole thing that all of creation is his, all of creation is sacred, whether it be the newly conceived child in the womb or the elderly person with dementia who doesn't know what's happening to him. I say that with great love because my dad has dementia, and he's as precious as the day he was born and the day he was conceived, and as are the waters that we need to survive, and the hills, and every life is precious. I have a bit of a trouble with cockroaches and ants, though. Sorry.
Catherine, but the way that you were explaining your work earlier, that you are looking after the women despite the fact that they might have had an abortion, which means also that their life is also from conception to death. So when you consider life and it's all interconnected, you're looking at the mother and the child and the mother who never had the baby. Is that right?
Absolutely. And even the extended family. A lot of the work I do will be the intergenerational trauma of the abortion. So I might be dealing with the daughter of someone who's had an abortion and how that's impacted the mother's maternal instinct, and that's impacted the woman I'd be counselling. So there's a lot of work nowadays done intergenerationally, and a lot of work is done with fathers who grieve the lost fatherhood experience. And so internationally, there's a lot of work in that sector with that intergenerational pain. But it is an area people just don't want to hear about.
When you say the family, the community are involved, so it's not just the woman, because sometimes it's called the woman's right, but it affects the woman herself and the child and the whole family.
And the whole family is the family grieve. The family grieves that lost grandchild, that lost nephew, that lost sibling. And there's a lot of work being done over the decades, some of it going right back to 1995, on the impact for those children of post-abortive women, and how their damaged maternal instinct, because of the pain they're carrying, and that damages their ability to relate. But that's no different from, to put that in perspective, anyone who's experienced trauma, that will affect them. So, if so there's lots of people. We on the East Coast, a lot of the Maori Battalion, there's a really good book on the 28th Maori Battalion, and how a lot of those men came back from the war with post-traumatic stress. and how that impacted them fathering and the future generations. And when I first heard that story about that book from Monty Srank, who wrote the book, it was at a Rotary meeting, I was like, oh my gosh, that explains my post-abortive woman, who the first correlations were seen between Vietnam vets and post-abortive suffering because of that post-traumatic stress. And so it's not uncommon for that trauma to go through families. And we forget when we're making that instant decision, there's a pregnancy, get rid of it. And that decision is often made within days of finding out they're pregnant. They're not even given time in our system in New Zealand to actually unravel all their options or all the opportunities this could give them. And often, it's heartbreaking because you see them thinking, I'll do this because it'll save the relationship, but the stats on that is far worse. They often don't save the relationship at all.
Catherine, talking about systems, etc., a couple of weeks ago, the government announced its budget in which $102 million were allocated for community health. So you're a pregnancy counselor and you have experience in finances and budgets. If you were given $102 million for community health, how would you allocate it within the health sector with your experience?
Well, it's like giving me a longy jar. Well, mental health is my big thing, but I do think people have to put a lot of people on the ground. There's got to be people on the ground helping in these areas. We can do a lot in prevention though as well, because what they don't seem to understand is they don't understand how all of these things are interrelated, and there's so many gaps, and they just don't seem to get the big picture of where the gaps are in society. I was dealing last year with another post-abortion counsellor. We're dealing with a group at your old workplace, and we were both saying how we wished we could just have somewhere for these post-abortive women who are in this area where they can't work. They're so emotionally disturbed, they can't turn up to work each day. They lose their jobs because they're not able to concentrate on their jobs, that kind of stuff. We wish we could find somewhere like a halfway house. They're not fit for the psych unit. They're not quite fit for the normal world at the moment. We need somewhere for them to be looked after and nurtured. But I have other clients who just need that kind of nurturing love and care, and we don't have a lot of that. But the other part of that is going back to a really practical side of it, is with the abortion decision, they don't seem to understand the long-term social cost of abortion. Now, we have a good idea when we're talking about other things like children of parents who are in jail, that kind of stuff, the social consequences of that. But we don't have an understanding of the interconnectedness of the abortion procedure with a person's long-term physical and mental health. And you look at sometimes the consequences or the thing, those medical conditions which can be amplified after, the risk of it is amplified after an abortion. There's a lot of fertility issues after abortion, more ectopic pregnancies, more miscarriages, lower weight for children at birth. There are all sorts of conception problems, risk of children who are a higher risk of children with physical disabilities because of the damage done to the uterus and the blood supply to the uterus. There's all sorts of things and there's a lot of cost further down the track with that. Even with the infertility issues, there's a lot of cost further down the track. We've got problems with greater heart disease, hugely larger numbers of mental health problems, with even, just generally about an 80% increase of medical visits for a post-abortive woman compared to the non-post-abortive woman. But for the psychosocial side of her life, that can be 180% increase. It's just, there's so many things. There's increased rates of suicide, increased rates of family violence. Often the men have been ignored in the decision-making process, and the men they can't handle their anger, so they get aggressive. But we've got huge problems in this country with family violence. No one ever bothers to see there's a correlation there, or huge numbers, 6 to 7 times more likely to commit suicide in the first year. And that increase in suicide risk goes on for years. I mean, those issues themselves are huge, but if we'd actually done better counselling previously, we may not have those ongoing problems. 5 times more likely to have addiction problems.
Yeah.
It's just, and yet each of those areas are huge. I mean, I looked at the budget and at the health budget itself, and I looked at them and I thought, gambling, the men, they go into addictions and things like that. It's just so many different areas of that whole area. Cervical screening, because you get higher cancer rates, higher breast cancer correlation. The money being poured into family planning and the sex education programs, even they're not even teaching people that sex actually has an emotional and spiritual part of it. And when we give these people, these young kids, sex education that just tells them go out there and do it with anyone you want because you've got a condom or you're on the pill or something, they're not telling them of the psychological problems that go with that bonding experience, because sex is a bonding experience. Chemical hormones are shared that bond you to that person. And so you have a young lady who's had multiple partners, that impacts on them. There's a lot of things that they are pushing all these agendas through, and it's really interesting. Even the euthanasia, people say all the time, we're not meant to put those two, euthanasia and abortion, together, but when you're on the Human Life Committee, of course we do. And there's been a lot of work done overseas that when people lose that respect for life, of their own species, they are more likely then, so if they've had an abortion, they are then more likely to choose euthanasia, because their respect for the sacredness of life has been lost. So it's really interesting. You see that trend around the world. Abortion comes in, 40 years later, euthanasia comes in. It's so much easier to get in because people have that desire to control their lives rather than give it up to trusting God and trusting his process and his guidance. Sorry, I've gone into the spiritual stuff, which isn't not necessarily where I was meant to be. But
if I summarize a little bit, is you would put a lot of this money into prevention and mental health
and education. And unfortunately, we are so far behind in that, because that the liberal sex education came in 20, 30 years ago. So we're dealing with a whole generation of that already, and the problems. And there is no wonder we have the suicide rates and the family breakdowns and the family violence, because we have so many hurting people, and everybody's trying to do the best they can, but I don't think people ever saw the consequences of what was happening.
Well, Catherine, now the last 2 years were quite different to your previous counseling years, and especially the last 10 months in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because we've had a time of social isolation and the doctor's appointments on the phone. And what has been the impact of this situation for your clients, the women who have been considering an abortion or who have had an abortion maybe during lockdown?
It's just, well, of course, abortion became legal up to birth in March 2020, when just as COVID was hitting New Zealand, and it became an essential service. So abortions was something that one of the medical services that people could get face to face. So you had a time when people were particularly emotionally vulnerable anyway, and they were making this permanent, life-changing decision. And so they were often making very rushed, irrational decisions. And if you think that your hormones are crazy in the first 3 months of pregnancy anyway, it's not a good time for making rushed decisions. But we saw a huge spike in the number of women, but often they tend to be younger, making in this particular situation, where they're suicidal within days of having their abortion. Within the first 2, 3, 4 days, suicidal. I mean, that's just horrendous. They actually physically attempted. They were definitely admitted to hospital. Sometimes they'd just get counselling, but I know we have services there, and over the years, certainly I've had terrible problems with some of the emergency numbers trying to get people to have help, but I don't think that is as bad as it was in the past. They do seem to be giving the people, they do seem to be recognising that people need help, but also, sometimes they don't want help. They'll lie so that they can get out of the psych unit. You know, they want to, yeah. It's such a vulnerable time for them, and they are not expecting. They might be warned that they'll have a little bit of grief, but they're not expecting this huge wave. And I mean, you have to understand, I know all this stuff sounds ludicrous when you're talking about it. Until you put into perspective, they have lost their own child. They have lost their child, and that becomes an overwhelming thing for them. I mean, I don't know how farmers' babies set area survives, because it's one of those places that people just hate walking through. They hate walking through the babies area because it reminds them of babies. They hate seeing their friends pregnant because it reminds them of what they lost. They hate seeing children the same age as what their children would have been. Well, that can continue for 10, 20 years. You know, there's just not enough education. I do try, and when I get an invitation to go into schools and talk about it, I try and pre-warn the kids that this is not an easy choice. You're pregnant, you can abort, you can carry it to term, you can adopt it out, you can get it fostered out. None of them are going to be easier, but they all have different implications long term, and some of them are definitely easier to live your life with afterwards. You know,
Yeah.
you don't have that huge sense of regret and mourning and grief.
But
Yeah,
if you consider you have lockdown and sometimes you say that the partner would force the woman to the abortion.
yeah,
And so if you're in lockdown and you have no escape, that would make things a lot more difficult.
yeah, yeah. Very difficult, very difficult. There was a lot of so there was a lot of we did a lot of there's a lot of online counselling done in that last year, 2 years. That's really increased our numbers in the online counselling and texting counselling, which is not ideal. Even over the internet is not ideal. But on the other hand, it's certainly, you know, been able to reach people who, you know, on the very, very outskirts of New Zealand. All of a sudden you can bring them into a group situation because you are doing it over Zoom. You're not necessarily doing it in the room with everybody wearing masks. So it's just not, you know. So there has been that good aspect of it, that we've been able to reach people all over the country. Yeah, sorry, I'm laughing. Likewise, so have the abortion services, because they just can mail out the abortion pills now, you know, so people are losing their babies at home, you know, which they've done. They can freight them out to people now. So, you know, it's a very it's a I mean, it's not like ordering a dress online, is it? And the very fact that you can get it online like that, without that personal, you know, I know they often will go and see a social worker at the hospital, but the social worker often just has one answer to the solution. And I think we need to be educating those people who are on that front line of counselling within our medical state funded systems, to be letting them know, when you put someone down that path, you aren't just giving them a 5-minute solution, you're giving them a life sentence. They've got to live with the knowledge of what they've done. And it might take 5 minutes to have the abortion, but my goodness, it takes a lot more than that to unravel the long-term physical and psychological impacts of that.
So what would be the counseling from the doctors, or how would they get the pills? They would just call and get the
Oh,
pills.
there's a telehealth service.
Oh,
There's a new telehealth service, and the main providers of that are Family Planning and Dr. Snook, who brought in the abortion pill into New Zealand, part of his company. Those are the two main financial contractors for that. So, I mean, there's big funding in the budget for family planning. So this is a totally taxpayer paid service. And then where the taxpayers also pay for the cleanup of it. In, you know, the next 10, 20, 30 years in our health system. And I know that sounds a terrible way of putting it, because that's the accountant in me, where every dollar that comes, you know, my clients goes in taxes, is spent on our roads or in our education services or in our armed forces, or, you know, every dollar can be spent somewhere. But this particular spend is being badly spent because the social cost is so huge. And if they sat in the, I mean, I sit there and I don't dare to tell the woman the long-term physical impact. And we might be able to heal her psychologically, but her body's still got the physical impact. You know, making money on it. They'll certainly still be making money on it. It's a very hungry machine. And I think that's why we have such difficulty in getting people it's their bread and butter. It's a multi-million-dollar industry.
What would you like to say to people who are listening to the radio interview?
If you have that life-death situation that you're following, whether it's at the beginning of life or the end of life, take time and don't be afraid to ask for help, because there are literally thousands of people out there all over the country who would be willing to step up and help you. Whether it's caring for your family member who's draining you, there are people willing to help. There are people willing to give you a break. You can get respite care. A lot of people who request euthanasia aren't necessarily people within the hospice system. They're people who feel like they're a nuisance. So what we have to do is make them feel like they're loved and they're valued and they're treasured. They don't feel like a nuisance, and then they won't be inclined to ask for euthanasia. At the other end of the spectrum, when a person is pregnant, offer them opportunities. Let them see the opportunities. Very often I meet couples and I can see that that child may have been what would have been. I think God is sending them that child to heal that relationship, heal that marriage. And then they go along the termination path thinking, and that's going to heal the marriage, when statistically it's never going to. It's, statistically on the back foot straight away. So I mean, there are if you've got nowhere to stay, you're afraid of your partner, you're afraid of your family, your parents maybe, we do have homes that people can go and stay with. Family Life International have a home out at Bombay. There are actually homes scattered all over New Zealand where people can go and stay and get full free care while they're pregnant. And the people often will have people staying on for years afterwards if they need that nurturing for them and their baby. So whatever stage you're at, there are people out there willing to give you the love and support you need, give you the information you need, because honestly, I've turned up with a food parcel and clothes for the mother, the pregnant mother and baby and things like that. And that's been enough just to turn their heart, because they realize, oh, I can get through this. There are resources. Sometimes it's just really practical stuff, or it's just really going with them. I've got a friend who's great at going with them to WINS and sorting out their benefits, those kind of things, or sorting out immigration problems for them. Sometimes you just need someone to walk the journey with you, and there are people who are willing and open to.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for all your work you're doing in this field and for giving hope to people.
Well, hope is the thing. It's such a precious, life is such a precious gift, and it gives such joy, and that's what it's spreading, that joy and love.
And the joy is so important. That's why I called my initiative Titi Pounamu, Study in Joy. And
Study in Joy, yes.
and our next,
the key of both is exactly what I'm talking about, really, because education, understanding the implications of what's going to happen, and it gives you joy making the right decision instead of heartache.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and all the best, and kia kaha, keep safe.